Hi everyone, and welcome to this drawing video. In this video, I want to show you how to draw a waterfall and a stream. So for the supplies, for the sketching, I recommend using either an HB or an H or an F pencil like I used. For the shading, I mostly used a 2B pencil, and I actually ended up using a 6B towards the end to add some darker shading. I also used blending sticks and a small eraser to add highlights. And lastly, the paper I used is called smooth Bristol board. If you don't have these specific supplies, please don't worry. You can use any pencils and any paper, and I promise you can create something similar. I started off by sketching the top of the waterfall, just sketching rough shapes and angles, loosely holding the pencil and not pressing too hard with the lead. I wanted there to be fine, rough outlines at first, just getting an idea of the rough shape I wanted at the top. And then from that, I started sketching shapes of the individual rocks. And one thing I kept in mind was that I didn't want them to be the same shapes and sizes. I wanted there to be lots of variations. It's really important for this kind of drawing to find some references that inspire you, and that's what I did for this. Looking at different photos and seeing the way the water over time can create these amazing valleys, and the way it shapes and smooths all of the rocks. Once I'd finished sketching the rocks forming the cliff face around the waterfall, it was time to sketch the stream flowing towards us, and I started by sketching layers, just adding light lines, imagining them getting closer to the foreground. And I also placed some rocks to plan the stream around. And at this point I was always thinking about the perspective, starting with lightly sketched rough shapes and erasing them if I needed. And then with these rough shapes and the light outlines that I added of the stream, I could continue to build upon it, just adding more rocks and variations. Another thing that I was keeping in mind was that I didn't want the waterfall or the stream to be symmetrical on both sides, because that wouldn't be realistic. It would kind of take away from the natural look of the waterfall. And it makes it more fun to just approach it in a more relaxed way anyway, and just to add random details. So you can see I just tried to develop and add variations to the landscape. In the close foreground, I wanted the stream to drop down again, so I angled the water vertically, like the waterfall, and then I continued to sketch some more rock formations around it. I also wanted to add a background showing the water flowing down the valley with additional waterfalls in the distance. They didn't require as much detail, I just added layers, and I just really wanted to show the stream meandering down the valley in the far distance. With the sketch completed, it was time for the shading, and I started with the cliffs around the waterfall, using a 2B pencil, and I began by adding rough mid-tone shading at first, making sure to define the spaces between the rocks with darker shading. Then I also used a blending stick to smooth this first layer. Then, as I continued with the cliff face, I began to add some individual details to the rocks, sharp edges and some cracks, and I also added more shading to some of them to push them further into the cliff, so the cliff face doesn't look like a flat brick wall. Also, thinking about the mist from the waterfall, I decided to use the eraser to add some highlighting to some of the rocks, trying to create a shiny wet texture. And I want to mention that I'm imagining the sun shining from above and to the left. For the waterfall itself, I started by adding some light shading to it with a blending stick. Then I used the small eraser to add some highlights in the direction the water is flowing. And I decided to add some rocks at the bottom of the waterfall, and then I used the eraser again to show the water bouncing off those rocks. I also actually used the eraser to add mist, just tapping away at the shading I'd previously added to the rocks to create the mist effect. Next up, it was time to work on the foreground with the stream, still using the 2B pencil, and for the most part I started by adding a rough mid-tone shading, adding variations to define the shapes, and I continued to use the blending sticks to smooth this shading. I used the same method for the rocks on the smaller cliff faces on the left and the right, like I did with the larger cliff face around the waterfall. Eventually, I started to define some details on the banks alongside the stream, and I tried to create a cracked texture. I recommend using a sharpened lead for this to create the finer lines. I added more detail closer to the foreground and faded the textures towards the waterfall, and I used the eraser again to add highlighting on some edges. I should also mention that in this drawing I decided to try something a bit different, and I faded the details outwards on the left and the right. I just wanted to kind of see what this would look like. I was hoping it would give the effect of focusing in towards the waterfall. Then I used the same method again for the rocks closest to the foreground. For the stream, I began by adding reflections of the banks and the rocks in the water, and then I blended this shading and used the small eraser to add highlights along the edges of the water and to show it flowing over the rocks and to give the water some ripples. Towards the top of the drawing, I continued adding details to the top of the cliff, adding more of that cracked texture and adding shaded areas with the blending stick. Then it was time to begin working on the background, and this didn't require as much detail. I just added a similar cliff face around the waterfall with a bit of darker shading. And this darker shading actually really helped to make the highlighted areas of the main waterfall stand out. And I used blending sticks to add shading to some of the areas on the valley, just to define its shape. And I used the eraser again to add the water and the mist to the waterfall. I continued this for a couple more layers into the distance, adding less contrast and detail, and I also used a blending stick to fade the details even more. The valley was looking a bit flat, so I then decided to add some trees, adding light pencil lines at first to figure out where I wanted to place them. Then for the evergreen trees, I like to start off with rough areas of shading first, then I blend this shading, and then I continue to add more random details on top with the sharpened lead. I also like to use the eraser to add a few highlights to some areas. I like to approach drawing trees in this relaxed way, not worrying about creating any specific shapes or details, and I have a tree drawing tutorial on my channel as well that might help if you're interested. I'd like to try and think of some video ideas that could help. Lastly, I decided to use a 6B pencil to add some additional shading to some areas. The contrast between the shading and the highlighted areas really helps to focus the drawing to one area, and in this case that's the waterfall and the stream, so that's what I tried to do. So I tried not to put too much contrast in the background, and that really helps to make the foreground stand out even more, and it gives that illusion of distance. After adding these final touches, the drawing was completed, and I really hope this helps out. Every now and then I really enjoy working on stuff like this. I find it so relaxing, and that's why I hope this helps in some way. I highly recommend giving this a try. So be sure to let me know what you think of this in the comments below, and if you have any suggestions for future drawings or videos you'd like to see, then please let me know as well. I really enjoy hearing your suggestions. If you want to see more videos like this, then feel free to subscribe to my channel, and any thumbs up or shares on this video are hugely appreciated. If you want to follow and support my progress, then be sure to check out the links in the description for my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Patreon. And once again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you all soon.